What if I told you that the single most powerful weapon in the Canada-US trade war right now isn't a tariff? It isn't a coalition. It isn't a sanction. It is the absence of 6 words hidden inside a document that millions of Canadians think protects them. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop: the person who needs that protection most. His government signed it away, quietly, and then called it a victory. Right now, in the spring of 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing for the most consequential trade negotiation in Canadian history. July 1st is the deadline, the CUSMA review. The clock is running, and Donald Trump already knows something that most Canadians don't. He knows exactly what was deleted from the fine print when Canada rewrote the rules of North American trade back in 2020. He knows because his administration's negotiators helped delete it. I'm going to show you exactly what was removed, why it matters more right now than it ever has before, and why. Structurally, getting it back may be impossible without blowing up the entire agreement. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now, because we don't read the headlines on this channel. We read the contracts. Let's go back to 1994. NAFTA enters into force. Inside that agreement is a chapter that almost nobody talked about at the time, Chapter 11. The Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism (ISTS). Here's what it did. If a foreign investor, an American corporation operating in Canada, believed that a Canadian government, law, regulation, or policy was destroying the value of their investment, they could skip Canadian courts entirely. They could go straight to a private international tribunal, neutral arbitrators, outside the control of any single government. And Canada didn't just face some of these claims. Canada became the most sued country in the developed world under NAFTA. 35 Chapter 11 claims filed directly against the Canadian government. By 2018, Canada had paid out $219 million in damages, spent another $95 million in legal defense. At one point, pending claims against Canada totaled $2.6 billion. $2.6 billion. The cases were everything: pharmaceutical companies suing over drug patent protections, energy corporations suing over pipeline approvals, mining companies suing over environmental regulations. Every time Ottawa tried to regulate in the public interest, it risked a lawsuit in a private international court. For Canada, Chapter 11. ISTS was not a shield. It was a bruise that never healed. And so when it came time to replace NAFTA with CUSMA in 2020, Canada's trade negotiators made what appeared to be a brilliant sovereignty-protecting move. They ripped Chapter 11 out of the agreement entirely, between Canada and the United States. Gone, no more. Private investor state arbitration. The headlines were glowing. Canada escapes NAFTA's most toxic clause. Sovereignty win. The investor court Canada never wanted is dead. Canadians cheered. And that is exactly what they were supposed to do. Here is what the headlines didn't tell you. It wasn't Canada that drove the push to remove investor-state arbitration. Read the scholarship, read the legal analysis from John Johnson, a former advisor to the Canadian government during NAFTA negotiations itself, published by the C.D. Howe Institute in 2020. His conclusion. I'll quote it directly. Despite Canada's mostly negative experience with ISTS under NAFTA, it was the U.S. that sought to eliminate or curtail ISTS under CUSMA, on the theory that ISTS is a form of investment insurance encouraging us investors to invest elsewhere than in the U.S. Stop, read that again. The United States wanted ISTS gone. Canada agreed, and then Canada announced it as a Canadian sovereignty win. One side chased the front page headline. The other side secured a structural advantage hidden in the fine print. Canada was defending itself from American lawsuits under ISTS. Yes, that's true, and it was expensive and painful, but ISTS also meant something else. Something nobody discussed. It meant that the United States, specifically U.S. policy, was legally accountable to a neutral international tribunal. It meant there was a mechanism to force the world's largest economy to justify its actions before arbitrators who didn't report to anyone in Washington. That mechanism is now gone. Between Canada and the United States. What replaced it? State-to-state dispute settlement under Chapter 31, Article 31.8, which sounds strong. But here is the operational difference, and this is where everything changes. Under state-to-state dispute settlement, governments file complaints against governments. The process moves at the speed of diplomacy. It requires political will on both sides, and right now. One side doesn't feel like cooperating. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said it plainly in early 2026. Canada is lagging in trade talks. They're not lagging because Carney is incompetent. They're lagging because Carney has no legal mechanism to force the United States to a neutral table anymore. The insurance policy was canceled in 2020, and the claim just came due. This is not theoretical. This is not academic. This is happening right now. Let me show you what the structural shift actually means in practice. Under NAFTA Chapter 11, if the United States government made a policy decision that unfairly harmed a Canadian business operating in the United States, that business had a legal pathway, a direct claim, before a neutral panel, that the U.S. government could not simply ignore. Did any Canadian investor ever win under that system against the U.S.? No, the record shows 0 successful Canadian claims against the United States under NAFTA. But here's the operative word: pathway. The existence of that pathway shaped behavior. It meant us policymakers had to calculate the legal exposure of their decisions, not just the political exposure, the legal exposure. Now, that pathway is closed, and what replaced its state-to-state dispute settlement under Chapter 31 requires Ottawa to file a formal government complaint, wait for panel formation, and then wait for a ruling that the opposing government can choose to comply with slowly or choose to weaponize politically, if you follow this channel. You know we go deep on the numbers. Here they are. Canada's trade relationship with the United States represents approximately $800 billion in annual two-way trade, about $1 trillion Canadian. Roughly 75% of all Canadian exports go to the United States. The United States. About 17% of its exports go to Canada. We are each other's largest trading partner, but we are not equally dependent. Canada's economy without preferential U.S. market access does not look like the United States economy without preferential Canadian market access. One of those scenarios is a disruption, the other is a catastrophe. And Donald Trump knows this. His negotiators know this. And as of July 1, 2026, they have a structural mechanism to exploit it. That mechanism is Article 34.7, the review clause, the sunset mechanism built directly into CUSMA. Here is how it works. The agreement expires on July 1, 2036, but to prevent that expiration, all 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, must unanimously confirm they wish to extend at the 2026 review. If they don't, CUSMA slides into annual reviews. Uncertainty becomes permanent. Investment dries up. Businesses stop making 10-year decisions in Canada. Trump already told us what he thinks. In December 2025, sitting across from Carney at the White House, Trump called CUSMA transitional, not foundational, not permanent, transitional. That is a man telling you exactly what he plans to do with the expiration clock. Now, in any other moment in history, we could argue about leverage. We could debate the timelines. We could say Canada has cards to play, and Canada does. 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada, 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canada supplies the uranium, the aluminum, the steel, the critical minerals that power the American military-industrial complex. These are real assets, and Carney has been quietly building a counter-architecture 40 trade partnerships across 4 continents, signed since taking office, a diversification strategy, an attempt to reduce the bilateral dependency that makes Canada structurally vulnerable. But then, in March 2026, the external trigger event arrives. Oil price shocks from escalating conflict in the Middle East, specifically around Iran, begin rippling through global energy markets. Energy Now Canada and trade experts are already reporting that this could give Canada leverage in CUSMA talks because Canada becomes a more critical and stable energy source precisely when instability elsewhere spikes. But here is the brutal irony of that leverage. Canada can only exercise that leverage if it is willing to threaten to redirect energy exports away from the United States, and every day that threat remains theoretical rather than operational. The clock ticks closer to July 1st. The trigger event has activated. The hidden weapon is loaded. The question is who controls the safety. Here is why this is checkmate. Not difficult, not challenging. Structurally, architecturally, checkmate. Follow the logic. Carney needs CUSMA extended at the July 2026 review. Without extension, Canada doesn't just lose a trade deal. It loses the regulatory framework for every cross-border supply chain in the country. Auto parts, pharmaceutical approvals, agricultural standards, Digital services. Without CUSMA, trade between Canada and the United States reverts to WTO most favored nation tariff rates for Canadian autos, for steel, for aluminum, for lumber, for everything. The economic shock of that reversion would be immediate, severe, and felt in every province. So Carney must negotiate. He has no choice. Now, what does the United States want from that negotiation? According to public reporting and analysis from the CSIS, GD Supra, and policy researchers, the U.S. has outlined clear structural demands: changes to Canada's foreign ownership and control rules in telecommunications, air transportation, and parts of financial services, the protected sectors, the ones Canada has guarded for decades. As non-negotiable, concessions on digital trade and data flows, where Canada's Bill C-11 and digital policy positions conflict with American tech sector interests. Dairy market access, a perennial American demand that Carney has zero domestic political room to concede, Canada joining a US-led critical minerals trading bloc. On American terms, not Canadian ones, if Carney concedes these. He hands Washington structural control over sectors that Canada has considered sovereign territory for half a century. And here is the part that makes the trap perfect. Carney leads a minority government. Any major concession in the CUSMA negotiations creates an immediate threat of a no-confidence vote in Parliament. His political survival depends on not appearing to capitulate. His country's economic survival depends on securing the deal. He cannot do both. He cannot rebuild the legal infrastructure that was deleted in 2020. The ISS mechanism is gone, and the U.S. has no incentive to bring it back because the current architecture is working exactly the way they designed it to work. The shield is gone, the weapon points inward, and here is the most devastating part. This wasn't a theft. Nobody broke in and took anything. This was a transaction, signed, ratified, and celebrated. The call is coming from inside the House. Let me bring this down to your street, your telecom bill. The reason you pay some of the highest wireless rates in the developed world is because the Canadian market is protected from full American competition through foreign ownership rules. If those rules are conceded in the CUSMA review, which the U.S. has formally demanded, American telecom giants gain unrestricted access. Whether that means lower prices for you or simply new ownership of the same infrastructure at the same prices is an open question. But the Canadian control over that infrastructure, gone. Your job, if it is in auto manufacturing, aerospace, aluminum production, or cross-border logistics, has no protection if CUSMA enters annual review limbo. Businesses don't build decade-long supply chain commitments under annual uncertainty. Investment dries up. Plants don't get built. The jobs don't get created. Your mortgage, your rent depends on a functioning, growing Canadian economy. An economy that, without CUSMA certainty, faces the kind of investor confidence collapse that economists at the Bank of Canada have already flagged in their own January 2026 analysis of CUSMA scenarios. No deal extension, annual reviews, prolonged uncertainty. Those are not theoretical words. They are the description of a stalled economy. Your Canada, the one with protected cultural sectors, sovereign telecommunications, and a dairy supply management system built over 50 years. All of it is on the table. All of it is being negotiated right now, behind closed doors, with a July 1st deadline. That is not moving, and the legal mechanism that once forced the opposing party to a neutral table. Expired June 30th, 2023. The legacy IST's window closed quietly, without ceremony. Your savings, your job, your home, they have no private right of action, no neutral tribunal, only the political will of two governments, one of which has already called the deal transitional. Let me give you the timeline. 1994. NAFTA enters into force. Canada accepts investor-state dispute settlement under Chapter 11. The mechanism is painful. Canada gets sued 35 times, pays out hundreds of millions. But the mechanism exists, a legal floor, a neutral tribunal, a forced accountability structure for U.S. policy. 2020. CUSMA replaces NAFTA. Canada and, crucially, the United States eliminate ISTs between the two countries. Canada gets the headlines, sovereignty win, but the legal floor is gone, the tribunal is gone, the forced accountability is gone. What remains is state-to-state diplomacy, a sunset clock, and Article 34.7 2023, June 30th. The legacy IST's window closes permanently. The The last thread of NAFTA's investor protection framework expires, quietly, without ceremony, without a press conference. 2026. The clock hits zero, July 1st. The review begins. A government with no IST's backstop leading a minority parliament, facing an adversary who has spent 6 years understanding exactly what the architecture of this moment allows. And right now, today, Mark Carney is quietly building what he can: 40 trade alliances, critical mineral leverage, energy export diversification, a counter-architecture assembled piece by piece against a structural trap that was built in the fine print for years before he took office. The question I want to leave you with is this: does he know? Does Carney fully understand that the weapon being used against him right now wasn't built by Trump? It was built into the deal that replaced NAFTA, the deal signed and celebrated as a Canadian victory, the deal that deleted the 6 words investor-state dispute settlement between Canada and called that deletion freedom. When the history of this moment is written, the chapter title won't be how Trump pressured Canada. It will be how Canada handed over the lock and kept the key to nothing. The July 2026 CUSMA review is not a trade story. It is a sovereignty story, and the deadline is not July 1st, 2026. The deadline was June 30th, 2023, the day the legacy legal window closed. Everything after that, everything you're watching right now is the consequence. Subscribe to this channel. We track the review every step of the way. When the panels form, when the concessions leak, when the government calls it something other than what it is, you will know before anyone else does. And for the comments, here is the question I want you to answer: if Carney concedes for an ownership protections in telecom and financial services to secure the CUSMA extension, is that a strategic compromise that saves Canada's economy? Or is that the moment Canada stops being economically sovereign in the sectors that matter most? Tell me where you land. The debate starts now.